Good morning, everyone. How are you? I'm Anthony Crowell. I'm the Dean and President here at New York Law School, and I am so happy to welcome you to this morning's City Law Breakfast. We are very happy you're here and very excited that District Attorney Vance is here as well. The City Law Breakfast Series has been a mainstay of New York Law School for many years and has been really one of our most significant and primary connections to city government, and has given us a pathway to have significant impacts and an ability to shape policy discussions, legal discussions, and bring some of the most significant city leaders to New York Law School, and has really given us an opportunity to give our students an advantage to understand the value of the civic dialogue that New York Law School is so proud to create and facilitate. I am very happy that Ross Sandler has led this program for so many years. He was a mentor of mine while I was an adjunct professor here before I joined the faculty full-time as both a professor and now dean. And I want to introduce Ross, who will come here, but Ross has been a terrific leader for us, and we're very, very happy that he's created these programs. So Ross.
Well, I am delighted Anthony's here. It makes a big difference. I welcome everybody to these breakfasts. Just a couple announcements. On the table are copies of City Law, City Land. These are publications of the center, and those are available on the website or through subscriptions. I also, at the front there, we have books, the Conflicts of Interest book that we put out every year. We put this out in May. This is the 2012 edition. We put it out in conjunction with our CLE program with the Conflicts of Interest Board every May, and it's a great desk guide on conflicts of interest, and I hope you'll take a copy and then come back in May and get your 2013 copy. We are really delighted that District Attorney Cy Vance is here today. He is a Yale Law graduate, Georgetown Law School, a New Yorker. He had the good fortune, as I did as a young lawyer, to work for Robert Morgenthau at the District Attorney's Office, one of the great public leaders of New York City, who imbued in everybody who ever worked with him a sense of public service that's second to none. He rose very high in the hierarchy under Bob Morgenthau, and then left to go west, as many people do, to make their reputations, and he had a successful practice in Washington State, then came back in 2004 and joined one of the most wonderful law firms of people here in New York, the Morvillo law firm that did so much and continues to do white-collar crime. He had a successful practice there, and in 2010 became the district attorney, and brings to that office not unique skills, but unusual skills for those who've held the office. Mr. Hogan and Mr. Morgenthau were not trial lawyers. They were great public servants. He is a trial lawyer as well as a public servant, and that brings great skills and important skills and leadership to the district attorney's office. So we're delighted to bring him to the podium at the City Law Breakfast. This is the 106th breakfast, and we welcome you as the 106th speaker at our City Law Breakfast.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Dean, Ross, great to see you. I see many old friends here and colleagues in city government, and Commissioner Rose Gilhern is here. Great to see you. Thank you for the great work that you're doing and the partnership that you have with our office. And Shari Hyman is here from the city, and the work we do with the city in all areas, I think, is increasingly coordinated, and I really appreciate your partnership as well. It is great to be in this beautiful building in this neighborhood, and I am told coming over here that, and I even remember as I was speaking to some of the older assistants who were in the office, that when I was a line assistant, there was a bit of an urban legend that made the rounds in the Manhattan DA's office. And it was about a student from New York Law School who applied to the DA's office, and there was an interview process, and one of the questions was, well, why do you want to work here? And the answer was, it's the best commute. And she got the job. And I know Elizabeth Pell, one of your students who I was speaking with earlier, is currently working with our cold case unit in the DA's office. And one of the things that she said was, it's unbelievable to be able to be a student here, go 4 blocks down to the Manhattan DA's office and work on some of the most interesting, rapidly evolving areas of science and law. And it really is true that the proximity of your campus and our office is to both our great benefits. And it's also true that the alumni of your school are well represented in our DA's office, and I'm very glad for that. And your alumni are working on the more than 100,000 cases that our prosecutors field every year in the Manhattan DA's offices. And they're applying the lawyering skills, the ethical sensitivities, and the training that they learned here so well to the cases that we believe are so important. And to begin with, that history, that relationship is why I am so pleased to let you know this morning the latest chapter in the collaboration between the Manhattan DA's office and this law school. And it is the development of a new clinic that will give New York law students hands-on experience in our office and will give the criminal justice system the benefit of their time, effort, energy. The clinic is going to be a central part of a new quality of life court part, a new initiative we established in the DA's office in 2011 in partnership with the Office of Court Administration. Now, the quality of life cases that the court part handles are misdemeanors and violations. Cases like shoplifting, for example, that collectively have a huge impact on the lives of New Yorkers every day. And these cases may sound like minor offenses, but anybody who's involved in criminal law knows that is not the reality. There is no minor case, period. There's no minor case for a victim. There is no minor case for a witness who has to come down to court and testify. There's no minor case for a police officer. And there is no minor case for someone accused of crime and members of their family. So every case matters to everybody. It matters personally to me. And enforcing these kinds of quality of life offenses are also crucial, we believe, to the continued health of our communities around Manhattan. But the reality is when thousands and thousands of these cases arrive in our courthouse and come into the criminal justice system, they have the capacity to overwhelm the courts to deal with them and to handle them responsibly. And they pull resources, additionally, from the more serious misdemeanor cases that we need to handle, like driving while intoxicated and domestic violence, something I'll talk about later. And that's why we implemented a new strategy last year designed to try to move these sorts of cases into a specialized court part to help us reduce the backlog of cases in the regular court parts to better serve everybody involved in the justice system. And those cases going into the quality of life part are handled by a single judge who is able to monitor the case from A to Z, and where direction is given to a young defendant to accomplish certain objectives in order to have the case dismissed. You have one judge who's making sure that it's accomplished. So we get better results, we believe, for all involved in the system by having the specialized court part, and it has been a remarkably successful thus far to us, and I'll tell you why, because we tracked some of these results. In the first year of its operation, there were more than 4,000 cases that moved to this quality of life part. And that helped us significantly to deal with some of the backlog we had in our overburdened criminal court. With that decreased backlog and increased attention to our more serious misdemeanors, we were able to realize some real changes between 2009, just before I took over, and the end of last year. Our speedy trial dismissals were down 45% in misdemeanor court. DW speedy trial dismissals, driving while intoxicated, went down 90%, 87%, almost 90%. The number of criminal court trials we were able to commence in that time period went up 81%. The number of jury trials went up 33%, and the number of bench trials went up 134%. Now, I don't want to bore you with statistics, but I do want to tell you that those statistics reveal that the strategies that we are employing, including this quality of life part, to help deal with the real crisis in criminal court, managing this huge number of cases responsibly, that these strategies, I think, are having a great effect. And New York Law School and its students are going to help this program succeed even further, and I think have a huge impact on the welfare of our court system. So I come this morning to say thank you, and I look forward to working with your students every day over the next few years. Now, there's many people in this room, as I look around, who've chosen to work in the area of public service. And I assume that group is going to forgive me, or it may even thank me, if I make a boastful statement. That's also, I think, an unassailable statement. New York City is unique. It's different, simply, from even other great cities. And it's unique because what happens here affects the world in fundamental ways. It affects it in arts, in academia, in our design studios, and in government. What goes on in New York City is emulated, admired, or at least it's certainly debated and discussed all over the globe. And the impact is multiplied many, many times when we consider the reach of New York's financial institutions and markets. Financial transactions of all sizes from all over the world are in fact cleared through New York financial institutions, many on Wall Street, just a mile from this building. And our office has long taken the position that sound public policy not only justifies, but it in fact demands that the District Attorney of Manhattan prosecute serious financial crimes that cross our borders, whether physically or in this modern age when the internet is our 21st century crime scene in cyberspace. And there have been many applications of this principle over the years, certainly many that were made known by my predecessor. But I'd like to offer just one recent example to give you a sense of how important this job we have is and how much I believe is at stake. The United States and its allies have imposed a series of sanctions to force Iran to halt its nuclear weapons program. Now, I believe the importance of this to our international community, to our country, to our state, and to our city can't be overstated. And one important sanctions initiative was directed against the Islamic Republic of Iran shipping lines, which is known as Irisl, one of the largest shipping companies in the world. And partly, these measures against Iran's major shipping company were imposed as part of a general economic sanctions against Iran's economy to encourage a negotiated end to its nuclear program. But the sanctions against Irisl had a more direct impact as well. The ships of the Iranian fleet were being used to transport materials believed to be used to develop nuclear weapons. They were also being used to transport conventional weapons, including a cache of hundreds of tons of rockets, missiles, and mortars that analysts believed were headed to Hezbollah. Stopping the Iranian fleet would be an important step to slow the spread of conventional and nuclear weapons. Now, the international shipping industry, like most industries around this globe, conducts business primarily in U.S. dollars. And that means that eventually its transactions must clear through American banks in New York. And so once the sanctions were imposed, our banks initiated sophisticated computer systems to detect and block payments from these sanctioned entities. Those efforts we hoped would deliver a devastating blow to the Iranian fleet, as well as many, many other businesses operating in these sanctioned countries. But almost immediately, my office became aware that Irisl had developed a scheme to evade these sanctions. Irisl enlisted corrupt individuals and corporations to launder payments through aliases and alter ego enterprises that would evade detection by New York banks. And in this way, tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars in payments were disguised by falsifying electronic and other records, and many through New York's banking system. We conducted a long investigation, and last year, after that investigation, our office indicted 11 corporations and 5 individuals for their roles in this conspiracy. Now, our partners in the federal government have also played a role and have now placed many of the newly indicted corporate enterprises on its sanctions list so that payments can't again be laundered by them. And this ERISL case is only one case in a front of our efforts to use New York's jurisdiction to combat global terrorism. Now, I know in the past months and in the past years, I hope many of you have heard of some of the cases colloquially referred to as stripping cases. And in these cases, banks stripped codes from electronic banking records which otherwise would have tripped filters used by our banking system to hide the fact that payments cleared in New York were coming from and related to sanctioned countries. Lloyds Bank, Credit Suisse, and Barclays entered into deferred prosecution agreements with our office and with the Department of Justice, and this summer we resolved a similar case against ING Bank for $619 million. And that amount for that settlement alone should give you a sense of the enormity of the problem and the schemes. In total, over the last 4 years, our office alone, the Manhattan DA's office, is on track to deliver $900 million or $1 billion all total to the city and state of New York as a result of fines imposed upon these banks in this sanction effort. Now, I have an $80 million a year budget, and I think, if my math corrects me, that's certainly more than 10 times my annual budget. I think it speaks to, number one, we are in a city and a state that surely needs the money. And we are pleased to be able to return these monies to the city and state of New York to help balance budgets, fund programming, and to return illegal proceeds back to the state. But the impact of these cases, ladies and gentlemen, goes far beyond monetary settlements, which happen to grab the headlines. The cases ensure that rogue regimes and human rights abusers feel continually isolated and international economic pressure from sanctions. They prevent money that would fund terrorists and terrorism and interdicts that support structure. They prevent some of the world's most dangerous regimes from buying the material to manufacture weapons, and they support the concept that we have to have accountability and transparency in our international banking system and in our banking system in New York, because if we have sanctions, they have to mean something, and so we have to enforce them. We've learned through tragedy that New York's preeminence, all of the things that makes our city a source of leadership and inspiration around the world, also makes it a prime target for terrorists. But that same preeminence, I think, gives us the obligation, and we have the tools, to take a leadership role in this fight against terrorism, to interrupt terrorist financing and funding, and the international corruption that flows from it. I'd like to shift for a minute my focus closer to home. As it is the first job of the district attorney, I have always understood to do everything I can to ensure safety on our streets and responsibly handle all of the cases that come through our office and before us. This is no small task. I alluded to the 100,000 cases that our office handles this year. And Rose Gilhern, who is a former federal prosecutor, will, I think, acknowledge, at least as a point of reference, that 100,000 cases is more criminal prosecutions than the entire United States Department of Justice files each year nationwide. And it all happens here in one courthouse in Manhattan. Now, New York has become a much safer place in the last 20 years, and we have many, many people to thank, the police department, prosecutors, the communities. But as we read every day, and what disturbs me greatly is that crime persists, serious crime persists, in too many ways, in too many places in our communities. In our office, as we took a closer look at what was occurring in our county, looking at where crime was occurring and who was driving it block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood, building by building, one thing became crystal clear to me. Gang violence has turned certain neighborhoods in our communities into war zones. The members of these youth crews are becoming ever younger and, unfortunately, better armed. Many times we see violence for the sake of violence, as well as petty turf disputes that become fatal. In other cases, the allegiance of the members is bound by profit, whether it's drugs or selling weapons. Just last week in our courthouse, the most significant members of a 35-member crew that were selling PCP in the Milbank Frawley houses in East Harlem pled guilty under the state's new drug kingpin law to running a multi-million-dollar drug ring that had turned the Milbank Frawley houses into a crowded drug market. The residents at the development, seniors, children, parents, were unable to move around the development because there was notorious drug dealing going on in the corridors, in the common areas, customers lined up outside on the street coming in. It was absolutely an intolerable, unacceptable situation. The peak hours for the drug trade were when the kids were going to school and coming home from school. And that clearly is absolutely no way for a community to live and is intolerable. Our investigation in that case, talking about community partnership, was in fact started by a letter from the community complaints. In a letter signed to law enforcement that was anonymously signed by the concerned tenants of King Towers, which was an adjacent development, residents told us that they feared for their safety and implored us to bring an end to the drug dealing so that the families could go on with their daily lives without fear. And so we did. In partnership with the NYPD, we developed a long-term investigation which didn't focus on going out and arresting low-level drug dealers, but we set out to dismantle this ring from top to bottom. It took about 15 months, a lot of undercover work and a lot of methods that law enforcement uses that turned out to be very successful, but we moved in, and as I said, we took out, through an indictment, 35 members of this crew. And as of last week, 34 of those 35 have now been convicted in this case. But more importantly, it's not about what you take out of a neighborhood, it's about what you put into it. And if you were to go back to the Milbank Frawley houses today, this weekend, and I suggest you do, you'll see in that common area between the houses, what once was a war zone and a wasteland, you'll see a common area that's now been returned to the residents, where they planted trees and a garden. And on this Saturday afternoon, I can guarantee you, the grandparents will be sitting down with the grandchildren in the courtyard, enjoying the space that was rightfully theirs, but that had been stolen from them for years. When we take a beach, as a former NYPD commander once said powerfully, you have to keep it. And so the strategy in these cases is not only to have strong enforcement, but when we go in, to work afterwards with the community to make sure that the beach is not lost, the community remains restored, and that is a successful prosecution. Our office's focus on gangs, guns, and drug violence is obviously one of my highest priorities. I know it's true for Commissioner Kelly, and I applaud him for doubling the number of detectives focusing on youth gang violence, as he said he would do. I believe we're having an impact, although sometimes I understand it's hard to see and it's hard to feel. But one unit of our office alone, just to give you a sense, which a new unit we opened up called the Violent Criminal Enterprise Unit, has removed over the last 18 months more than 450 guns off the streets of Manhattan. It's the past 18 months. And it's broken up and prosecuted more than 120 individuals associated with 6 gang operations. So that's an indication that I think these efforts are in fact making a difference in partnership with law enforcement and the community. But I also know that as important as it is to prosecute aggressively, the answers to reducing crime long term aren't found in our courtrooms. That's why, just as an example, we are using money, funds that we have seized from drug cases, to fund sports programming in Manhattan designed to provide first-rate, exceptional sports programming for boys and girls 12 to 18 years old, Friday and Saturday nights between 5 and 8 p.m. when those kids are most at risk of being victimized or getting into trouble themselves. Now this program, here you go. And the key to this program is exceptional programming. It's not Cy Vance showing up on Friday and saying, kids, I'm going to show you how to shoot a free throw, which would be comedic. We hired Pro Hoops, which is a extraordinarily professional training group. They train the pros, and they train people who have enough resources, whose kids are in college, to hire, to train their kids to become pros or to make the varsity team. And they're now providing this programming to these kids. And Rose Gilhern was at one of our sessions earlier this year. Councilmember Jackson, I think, has stopped by as well. Good morning, Councilmember. And we've now opened 4 sites in Manhattan: Central Harlem, Henry Street Settlement, Lower East Side, Johnson Houses, and I know we opened up a place in northern Manhattan just a couple months ago. Now we have 1,170 kids signed up for this program, okay, after a year. And I know not every kid shows up every Friday and Saturday night. So it's not like we have 100,000 kids every weekend. But the point is, it's a significant start. I believe, like I think you believe, that a crime prevented is a much better end result than a crime prosecuted. And if we can keep, as part of our reducing crime mission, as part of our crime fighting mission, if the Manhattan DA's office can help keep kids from getting into trouble or being victims of gang violence, that makes sense to me, because that makes us safer. And the effects of these new strategies and policies and legislation, they don't translate into crime reduction overnight, certainly. And I know for residents and for the public, that is frustrating, and sometimes it's scary. But we have to keep trying. That's what we have to do. You just can never let your guard down. And so, for example, today we are directing additional resources to areas like combating vehicular crime, cybercrime, identity theft, fraud against immigrants, and forensic science, where Elizabeth is working. All areas in which we see a consistent need for additional staffing, training, legislation, and public attention. In that same vein, and before we open this up with the Dean's permission for questions, I want to highlight something that is very important to our office and to me. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and there are few causes that need as much awareness brought to it as the issue of intimate partner violence. Violent crime in our city has dropped, but intimate partner violence has not. We handled roughly 5,600 cases of domestic violence in the Manhattan DA's office last year. Our office alone. And last year there were 92 family-related homicides in 2011 in the city of New York. On any given day in New York City, there are 700 domestic-related incidents phoned in to the NYPD. 700 on a day. This past week, I was in court at the sentencing hearing of a man who had pleaded guilty to murdering his 23-year-old girlfriend. I sat at that hearing listening to the dad testify at a portion of the hearing as he recounted, obviously, the tragic pain or the tragedy and the pain that he felt at having lost his daughter. Of course, the great tragedy is that the young woman who was the victim knew that the boyfriend was unstable, but she did not know how to get out of the relationship, where she should go, and how she should get help. Those statistics about domestic violence, the 5,600 cases, the 92 family-related homicides, the 700 domestic incidents a day, leads us to ask this important question. What good is it to be living in the safest big city in America, as we do, if we aren't, in fact, safer in our homes? And we also know that domestic violence that is tolerated in the home spills out by modeling into criminal behavior into the streets. This domestic violence issue is not a criminal justice crisis, which it is in itself. It's a national health crisis. It's a public health crisis that affects not just our victims in the courthouse, but it affects them in terms of incurred medical costs, the problems of dealing with alternate housing, the problems of costs and dislocation for their children who are no longer able to live in the family home, and on and on and on. And this issue of domestic violence and the crimes related to domestic violence won't stop until we bring our full attention to it. Now, I want to give the governor great credit, one of my legislative priorities last year as the Manhattan DA was to create legislation that would enhance punishment for repeat domestic violence offenders. And the governor has yet to sign the bill into law, but it's been passed by both houses. And now an individual who has previously committed a domestic violence offense, even if it's a misdemeanor, for example, punching your significant partner in the face, which may not be a felony, if you commit a second domestic violence offense within 5 years, that second offense can be elevated to felony status. Because the current state of the law before was that I could abuse my domestic partner physically. I could punch my domestic partner in the face time and time again, and as long as it remained a misdemeanor, the penalties the court could impose were no more serious than for evading a subway fare. And that wasn't making sense. So the legislation is going to give prosecutors new tools. I applaud the governor. I applaud the NYPD and the city for their efforts in this. And we hope, with the partnership of the city, that we're going to be able to open a family justice center in 2013 in Lower Manhattan, where victims of domestic violence are going to be able, in one building, to go and report a criminal offense, seek counseling, seek housing help, meet with prosecutors to minimize the wear and tear on the victims of domestic violence so that they have all the resources they need in order to see these difficult cases through from A to Z. And we're hopeful that that will happen. I was very honored to run for this job, and both honored and surprised to actually have prevailed in it. It's a great office. Obviously, what the hallmarks of this office are set by my predecessors. It's an office that really was founded on the principles of nonpartisanship, fairness, in our handling of all our cases. And obviously, I inherited an office where the bar was set very high when I took over. And my hope is that for however long I'm privileged to hold this office, whenever I leave it, I will have left the office with that bar raised just a little bit higher. And with the help of the New York law students in our clinic program, you're going to help me get there. Thank you very much.
We'll start the questions, but I ask the dean to make a comment first.
I just want to thank the district attorney for this incredible opportunity that we have to partner with you and to develop a clinic. I know that our faculty will begin working with your office. They've had some early discussions, and we'll have our committees and our faculty make sure we have the best possible program put forward for our students. So I'm looking very forward to that. It'll also give us an amazing opportunity to truly say that New York Law School's campus now has the DA's office on it, or vice versa. I do like to say that Lower Manhattan is our entire campus, that it includes courts and Wall Street and the DA's office in City Hall, and it's really wonderful. And our clinical programs now, once this gets underway, will actually extend into not just Manhattan DA's office, but also Staten Island and Brooklyn. So we'll have Richmond County and Kings County DA, which is incredible as well. So lots of opportunities for our students. I should also just mention that we have a number of other partners. As the district attorney mentioned, Sherry Hyman at the Business Integrity Commission has taken externs from our school, as well as Rose Gilhern at DOI. I see the law department and Oath. So really great partnerships that extend all throughout city government. So thank you very much, and we look forward to that. You wanted to take some questions from
I'm happy to
the audience.
Okay, let me just, their microphones, I see you know the drill. You go to the microphone and you get called on. May I just ask that that comments are welcome, short comments are welcome, and questions, but only one question to a person, because I can see that there'll be multiple questions.
Thanks. Thank you, Dean. Thanks, Ross.
Yes, on this side first.
Okay, you see they're guarding me here. They're standing close to me.
I'm Charles Komanoff. My question is about vehicular crime.
Yep.
During your campaign 3 years ago, you promised to work with the police to curtail reckless driving and to prosecute motorists who assault and kill. Yet the NYPD continues to turn a blind eye to pedestrian and bicyclist deaths, and the aggressive investigations and prosecutions that you promised, including seizing vehicles' black boxes to get data that could assign culpability and assist in diagnosing lethal crashes, are nowhere to be found. 2 weeks ago, 2 automobiles collided at 59th and Park. One flew onto the sidewalk, killing Reuben Baum, a Korean War medic and lifelong New Yorker. Have you subpoenaed the black boxes from that crash? And if you have not, will you?
Okay, thank you. With request to the whether a subpoena has been issued, I honestly don't know the answer. I do know that black boxes, for those of you who are who may not understand what's being alluded to, are essentially the internal computer in a car, which provides a lot of information. I will say that the issue of being able to capture the data out of black boxes, I understand is slightly more complicated because it relates to industry code. But in any event, the short answer is I don't know whether we've subpoenaed it. But I will say that if the premise of your question is that we don't take vehicular crime seriously, you're wrong. Just this week, I think we are going to be having extensive training in the downtown county areas from our office on vehicular assaults and homicides and other vehicular-related crimes among the county DA's offices. And I think it speaks to the determination by our office to make sure that we train our assistants in doing the best job we can in these difficult cases. Just some statistics to respond to the general tenor of your question. Leaving the scene of an accident, a very common issue, has been charged by our office 127 times this past year. The more serious charge, leaving the scene of a crash that resulted in serious physical injury or death, was charged by our office 10 times in 2009, 17 times in 2011, and it's been charged 37 times this year to date. I'd also look to some of the significant cases that our office has prosecuted in the area of vehicular deaths over the last few years. Jessica Altruz pled guilty to manslaughter in the second degree and leaving the scene of an accident, an felony, and was sentenced to 1 to 3 years in prison. That's the scope of the punishment that the statute provides. Keston Brown, an individual, was sentenced to 15 years last year in prison after being found guilty by the jury to manslaughter in the second degree, assault in the second degree, and operating a vehicle while intoxicated. Carmen Huertas, as you well know, which was sentenced to 4 to 12 years for recklessly driving and killing, tragically, young people, which resulted in Leandra's Law. Dyson Williams and William Robbins were cases in northern Manhattan involving vehicular assault and death that were prosecuted, resulting in substantial jail sentences. This is not an easy area. Not every crime, not every accident is a crime, but I do say that our office endeavors, even if imperfectly, endeavors to treat the investigations of all these cases as seriously as we can, to urge the NYPD to work with us to have a more rapid response to vehicular death cases. I think we are making progress. I think some of those statistics bear out those facts. That said, and I completely understand that there are far too many vehicular-related deaths in this city. It is something that we need to be focused on. It is something that I believe we are focused on, and it is something that we will continue to be focused on.
On this side.
Thank you, Richard Jordan, Chairman, Chairman of the Committee of Non-Governmental Organizations on the UN and Sports. In the issue of domestic violence, have you considered using the ancient Olympic truce, which is the period before, during, and after the Olympic Games, which used to guarantee safety of passage, as an educational tool for these 1,170 youth who participate in this sports program that you have established? Thank you.
I can honestly say I have not. But I can say that when I understand it better, I hope that you will speak to one of the members of my staff who are here, and that they take the information that you have, and that whatever, it sounds like a very good idea and we should consider it. I just don't know what it is yet. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Good morning, Alan Flax. Before putting the question, I see Jack Lynn, former Assistant Parks Commissioner, is here, and I wonder if he's going to put a question as to whether, on the issue of the arbicide, a term coined by Henry Stern for killing and not cutting down trees. My question is that referring to money laundering, white-collar crimes, and the like, and recalling that in one of the later novels of John Steinbeck, he said that banks are honest, but bankers aren't. I wonder if you could opine, what is the motivation of these people who feel they can launder money or fool around or violate, say, the Martin Act? What is their motivation for doing this? Is it, besides wanting more money?
Alan, to answer that question, it's a serious question, and I don't want to be frivolous in my answer. And I don't also want to paint any industry with a broad brush, without being fact specific. Excuse me. I think typically financial crime is motivated by desire for profit, a desire for more money, a desire to bend the rules in order to enhance individual profit, perhaps between traders, or corporate profit for the business. I don't think it's that complicated, and I think with most economic crime, the motivation is about money.
Thank you.
On this side, let's go this way.
Yeah, sir.
Hi, my name is Keegan. I'm a member of the Board of Directors of Time's Up, a 501c3 environmental education group. Thanks for speaking publicly and taking these questions. You began your speech with ways of taking less time on small cases and focusing on bigger cases such as domestic abuse. My question might speak to that. I was wondering the complicitness of your office in the suppression of public demonstrations such as those organized by Occupy Wall Street. I've personally been arrested 3 times at Occupy Wall Street events while not committing any crimes and obeying all police instructions. And all of those times the DA has dropped my case, obviously wasting lots of resources, time, and money that could be better spent pursuing cases like domestic abuse or, like Charles Kamenoff mentioned, vehicular deaths. And I was wondering, why doesn't your office demand the NYPD stop making these dubious arrests and intimidating protesters and discouraging dissent, and spend more time pursuing more serious cases such as domestic abuse?
Okay. Let me say that the job of the district attorney is not to direct the mayor or the police commissioner about how they deploy their resources, or actually about the decisions they make in the field. The job of the district attorney is to make sure that those cases that come into the courthouse, that cross the line into my jurisdiction, are handled as best we can, fairly, responsibly, and guided by the principles of enhancing fairness and public safety. In your case, it sounds like we did our job. If, in fact, we dismissed 3 of your arrests because we found that the evidence did not justify it, It sounds to me as if our assistants did exactly what they're supposed to do and what they did in all 2,300 of the Occupy Wall Street cases, which was not, by the way, an easy situation to manage from a prosecutor's office, which is the commitment was that we would, as best we could, review each one of these cases and determine individually whether or not there was sufficient evidence to either charge or to take to trial. And where we found the evidence was lacking, as we presumably did in your case, we should dismiss them, and we did. So I think that speaks to the performance of our role as prosecutors, and that we are taking our role seriously. That's really that's going to have to be my response to your question.
Thank you.
My name is Scott Kaplan. A broad coalition of city groups have called for the creation of an independent inspector general to monitor the NYPD. I would point out you said nothing until this last question about abuses by the NYPD. A federal district judge has certified as a class a lawsuit against Stop and Frisk, and a separate lawsuit involving trespassing in New York City public housing projects. When you were running for district attorney, you did not appear at a forum on civil liberties by the New York Civil Liberties Union. So my question is, part of the impetus for this bill is the closeness of district attorneys to the NYPD. You praised the commissioners of DOI and the NYPD. How are you able to monitor the NYPD and prosecute police abuses? With respect to the last question, you could have prosecuted police. Have you prosecuted any police officers for abuses at Occupy Wall Street events or other political protests? And what is your position on abuses by the NYPD and this particular bill?
Okay, well, a couple of questions tucked in there. The New York City Police Department has 5 county DAs and 3 federal prosecutors who are responsible for and do indeed, I believe, bring cases where the evidence warrants criminal cases against members of the NYPD. And if you've been reading the same newspapers that I have over the last several years, I think you will be seeing, you will see those cases having been brought by both federal and state prosecutors. I think there is also obviously a Civilian Complaint Review Board, and so I think there is actually a large number of investigative and prosecutorial forces that are investigating and indeed prosecuting. You ask about stop and frisk, and I think it's a good example, and so I'll just wade in if I can. And I think it speaks to the very fine question by the gentleman who asked before. I can't. It's not the purview of the district attorney to direct the commissioner or the mayor how to deploy their police officers in the field, and actually it's not our power to tell them who they can stop. But when they do make a stop, it is our obligation to make sure that those cases that come into our office are screened for constitutional viability. I was speaking last night to our assistant DAs. We have a lecture on stop and frisk that we're doing, we do for all our office, and I was addressing this issue, and it is really our responsibility to make sure that we screen cases that come into our office to make sure that the constitutional principles related to when an officer can stop and seize and take evidence, that those constitutional parameters are held, and where the evidence is lacking, that the case be dismissed as they are. The second point speaks to your question about abuses. In the stop and frisk area, for example, where we see a police officer has in fact engaged in repetitive abusive behavior that rises to the level of a criminal conduct, we have in fact charged, indicted, and convicted officers for that kind of conduct. I think it's earlier this year there was an incident. There were 2 officers in northern Manhattan. One was a sergeant, one was a patrol officer, and the conduct they had engaged in was to effect stops many of them involving vehicles, fabricate the evidence about the bases for those stops, and then to testify falsely to the grand jury and to provide false statements to the court about the bases for those stops. And when we found out about it, we investigated, we prosecuted it, and the cases were convicted. The third area is that I think that also when I ran to office, I think when you run an agency, you have to address the culture of your own agency and issues that you may have in your own agency as the first principle. So one of the things that I have done is I've asked the Vera Institute, and they've started this process, and it will be some time before they complete it, to conduct essentially a racial bias review of the work of the Manhattan DA's office. I've asked them to take a look at our plea bargaining policies, our charging policies, our bail decisions, and to report back to me about what they see after they've done that review as to whether we have any issues that we should be concerned about. And if we do have them, then I'll address them. And I looked as a model for this to another county in Minneapolis, in Wisconsin, where Vera had come in and done the same thing. I don't know what the answer is going to be. I don't know what Vera is going to tell me, but I do believe that if we do have any bias, and I believe it will be entirely subliminal, but if we do have bias in those kinds of important decisions, I want to know about it, and then I want to be able to take corrective measures to deal with it as the head of the agency. And finally, there are legislative issues that address some of the things you're talking about. I stood next to Governor Cuomo about 2 months ago asking for the laws for possession of marijuana to be changed. It's currently a crime to possess a small amount of marijuana out of your pocket, but it's not a crime to possess it in your pocket. Sort of the permeability of one piece of fabric distinguishes between what's a crime and that's not, and that didn't strike me to be either fair or commonsensical, because I want to take those 5,000 cases that result in, from low-level marijuana possession cases that are outside the pocket, and I want to pull those resources and want to put them into the gang cases and the domestic violence cases and the more serious cases. And I also think it's just not, it's more fair not to have a crime created by a 2-inch difference and a piece of fabric separating it. So, I think your sense that the culture of the office is not sensitive to investigations involving police misconduct, I think that's wrong. I think we prosecuted a number of police officers since I've been district attorney. I think we take these issues very seriously. They're often not easy cases. But when you look at the record, I think the record reflects a deeper involvement, a more serious attention to the issue than your question states in its premise.
Let me just say that we always like to end at 9:30, so the 4 people standing are the last, and I hope your questions are short.
Hi, good morning. Brad Aaron. I also have a question about particular crimes. In 2009, in reference to the so-called Rule of Two, you said, quote, "There is no reason why 2 traffic violations are necessary in order to support a conviction of criminally negligent homicide," end quote. Has your office prosecuted homicide cases that involve only 1 traffic violation, such as speeding or running a red light? And if so, have you been successful with those? If not, when will you challenge the Rule of Two?
Brad is the name?
Yes.
Yeah. Brad, I honestly I can't answer that question precisely. I'm sure I can get back to you with the information. I know I sit and I talk with assistants when we review some of these cases as to what charges we should bring and what charges we can prove. And we obviously are looking at the total factual scenario that involves in an incident, whether it is speeding plus the other dynamics, plus the other factors that are ongoing immediately before the accident occurs. So what I can say, Brad, is I hope we'll be able to get back to you that information that I don't have at hand. And when we do, you certainly should feel free to call again and ask, and we can follow up on the discussion.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good morning. Tiffany Carey from Bloomberg News. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Tiffany Carey from Bloomberg News. Can you talk a little about the scope of your money laundering and sanctions violations probes, and why so far we've only seen European banks rather than, say, Chinese or U.S. banks making agreements?
I think the probes have, I think the reason of the latter is that the foreign banks were in fact withdrawing, stripping the information from the electronic payment transfers in order to evade being caught, evade tripping what are called OFAC filters domestically. So I think the reason is because the conduct was was committed by foreign banks in order to move money through the American banking system. And as to the scope, I think the scope of, we've had 5 cases that I alluded to, 4 or 5, Credit Suisse, Lloyd's, Barclays, ING. The scope of that conduct is really outlined in the extensive statement of facts that go along with those deferred prosecution agreements and settlements, and they relate to money movement for Iran, other sanctioned countries, ranging from Libya, Sudan, Cuba in some instances. It relates to money that is linked to, as in the Arisal case, to movement of munitions that may relate to terrorism, and in the banking cases, terrorism and or simply moving money for sanctioned entities which may have become sanctioned because of their human rights violations or there are other reasons they may have gotten on the sanctions list. So the scope is quite broad. I think those are 4 huge financial institutions that have been implicated and now resolved their cases, and I think it speaks to the commitment of our office and our federal partners to continue to do work in this area on a broad scale.
Hi, good morning. Bradford Sussman at Pitt-Giblin, and I'm alum of both New York Law School, actually New York Law School, the Center for New York Law, and your office. And I really wanted to encourage all my colleagues here. I was at the Crime Strategies Unit. You put together a fantastic program, and I really want to encourage everyone to apply for all the internships and externships because they're really terrific. And I guess, yeah, really. I guess to the extent that I have a question, maybe to the extent you can talk about it, what kind of work are you doing in your crime strategy unit? They're really a terrific bunch of people, and it's a wonderful concept, and I thought if you wanted to touch on that.
Time? Very, very briefly, when I ran for DA and I looked at the issue of what's the role of a district attorney who takes over an office when crime is at historic lows. It can't be simply to sit on your hands and say, okay, I hope it doesn't go up. It has to be, what other strategies can you employ using our technology, our manpower, 535 assistant DAs, it's a huge manpower, to work to drive crime even lower. And so what we decided to do as an office was to change a little bit the way we do business. I mean, typically DA's offices tend to, reactive is maybe, is not, I'm not trying to be negative, but tend to start with the police delivering the case and working from there. It was my belief that we really needed to be ourselves intelligence-driven as a prosecutor's office, really following the federal model. We needed to identify who were the drivers of crime, where was crime occurring, and then to proactively as an office move forward on the balls of our feet to attack those areas without waiting for someone else to tell us what to do. So we divided the County of Manhattan into 5 zones, and we created a crime strategies unit separate from our trial division. We staffed the crime strategies unit with experienced prosecutors, one responsible for each zone with an analyst and law enforcement. Their job is essentially to advise me, as I say, block by block, building by building, neighborhood by neighborhood, what crime is occurring, who's driving it, and then we try to develop strategies to dismantle the groups behind those offenses. It also means, and I spoke to that in terms of our gang prosecutions, the peace prosecution, and the others that I spoke about. And that's the method by which we are focusing on driving crime down, who is driving violent crime, where is it occurring, being proactive with long-term investigations. That's a core strategy. But it also means that you need to identify who are the people who are serious offenders and make sure that when they come into your system, they don't get overlooked. I think just last week, Aaron, we had maybe it was just a couple of days ago, but let me give you an example which it's actually really, these are really significant cases, but they don't strike you as significant in the sense of homicides and the like. When you have someone who has a recidivist, When you have 100,000 cases, it's very difficult, it's often difficult to make sure that when that person comes into the system for a new arrest, that it doesn't get lost in the 100,000 cases. That we need to make sure that the serious offenders, and they're not that hard to identify, there's a small number of people who cause a disproportionate amount of crime in every neighborhood. And one example was a gentleman in central Manhattan, whose last name escapes me, but he had been convicted 60 times for various offenses and one felony. And what his specialty was the crime called jostling. Now, jostling, for those of you who don't know what it is kind of a New York crime. It's you pick a tourist walking down the street who's on 57th Street looking up at the GM building, going to the Apple store. You bang into them, you drop your glasses, which have already been broken, and then you start to scare the bejesus out of the tourist, saying, you bumped into me, you've broken my glasses, you start to berate them, you start to threaten them, and you basically shake them down using the force of your intimidation for a couple $100. This happens again and again and again and again, particularly in the areas of tourists in Manhattan. And if you're the victim of this, as many of you probably have been or know somebody have been, it's actually pretty scary. So this gentleman was a specialist in this kind of crime. But the court system, by the time he got in, no one paid attention to it. No one identified this guy as actually someone we should pay attention to. The Crime Strategies Unit changes that dynamic. This gentleman happened to be on our radar. And we know that when this gentleman comes back in, we need to make sure that the assistant district attorney writing the case up in the complaint room, in the bowels of the DA's office, in the middle of the night when the case comes in, understands that Mr. X isn't just a minor pain in the neck. This guy is really a persistent recidivist that's having an impact in Midtown Manhattan. And in this gentleman's case, to his misfortune, he did it again. The case came in. Our Crime Strategies Unit got notified, communicated immediately with the assistants in the office. The case, rather than being treated typically as it would as a pettit larceny or a minor misdemeanor offense, was treated as a robbery 3. Why? Because he was using force and intimidation to shake down the victim. The case was indicted instead of handled as a misdemeanor. The man was outraged. How could he be indicted? He wanted to go to trial. He went to trial. He was convicted, and he's now doing state time. That's focusing on the crime drivers and making sure that wherever they come into our criminal justice system, those cases are not lost in the shuffle and they're treated seriously. And if you can do that, then you actually are, I think, having an impact on those people that small number of people who disproportionately affect the quality of our life in Manhattan. And I think that's the concept of intelligence-driven prosecution, whether it's as to gangs, whether it's to the recidivists who affect the quality of our lives. That's how we believe we can do a better job proactively of making Manhattan safer.
This has really been a very stimulating morning. One of the things that I got out of this was just how personal the work of the office is, whether it's domestic violence or in the apartment houses or on the street or vehicular injuries. Your office really does touch all of us, and we thank you for what you're doing in that office and also for coming here today and making it so clear to us how important it is. As we always do, we like to give to our speakers a product of the scholarship of this law school, and I have weighty material for you. The Law Review has 2 big issues this year on criminal justice. One, juvenile justice reform in New York, and the other, exonerating the innocent, pretrial innocent procedures. These are terrific symposium, and they're in the volumes. I hand them to you with delight and with thanks for a wonderful morning. Thank you so much. We will see you in November.